All right, here's my word for the day. Submit. Now, don't you like that word? Come on. You like it, don't you? No, you don't. Man, the minute I say that word, some of you tense up. I can see it in your face. Some of you are okay with it. Some of you are more godly than people like me. But the moment you hear that word, like for some of us, it's not an easy word. In fact, if someone walks up to you and says submit, you might look at them and go, make me, dude. Right? I mean, come on, we can own it. And yet if you, the reason is we don't like giving up control, do we? If you're anything like me, and I pray that some of you are not, but if you are, listen, I like to do what I want to do, when I want to do it, the way that I want to do it, and for whatever reason that I want to do it. And I don't like answering to other people about it. And so that word submit is almost an offensive word to many of us in our world and in our culture. And yet throughout the Bible, God time and time again tells us to submit. In Hebrews 13:17, he says that we should submit to the leaders of the church. In 1 Peter 2:13 through 14, he says submit to government officials, everyone's favorite, right? And in Ephesians 5:22, he says wives submit to your husbands. In Colossians 3:20, he says children submit to your parents. In Colossians 3:22, he says you should submit to your boss. In 1 Peter 5:5, he says the younger people should submit to older people. And when you read that list, it's just, some of y'all are looking at your kids, aren't you, right now? But listen, when you read that list, you go, man, that's hard. And look, that's not even counting all the times that God says that we need to submit to Him. But at least we can understand submitting to God. Like that at least makes sense to me. I mean, He's God. He created everything. He's all powerful, all knowing, all present. There is none greater, and everything in all creation combined does not even come close to the power and significance and majesty of God. So I may not like it, but I can at least understand submitting to God. But when you start talking about my boss who's a jerk, or when you start talking about our government who's like, well, never mind, you know, right? When you start talking about your spouse or your parents or your whatever, fill in the blank, you go, but God, they're not worthy of it. Like they're not good enough. Do you know what they've done, God? Do you know how they are? And yet you're telling me that I need to submit to them. You know, in the book of Ephesians, Paul, sort of in the second half of that letter that he wrote to the church in Ephesus, he does this section on relationships within the church. He talks about husbands and wives and parents and children, and he talks about your relationship with your boss, with your employer. He talks about your relationship within the church, and he begins this section with one really simple and powerful verse where he says, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. That word submitting is a powerful word because it literally means to place yourself under. There's a physical aspect to that because the root word for submit or submitting is where we get the word bow from. And it was the idea that if you went before a king, you would have to bow, right? Bow to show is a physical representation of what your life was, which was that you were putting yourself under the authority of that king, of that ruler, of that person. And so you would bow to show your significance. But it wasn't just a physical action, right? Because quite honestly, if I put a sword to your neck and say bow, most of you are going to bow, right? If I put a gun to your head and say bow, most of you are going to bow, but that doesn't mean you're submitting, right? That's a different thing. That just means I've got more power over you. No, the idea of the word here, the idea of what that word means is not just that I'm physically doing something, but that I am embracing the authority that another person has over me. If you submit, if you submit to someone, you say that they have authority over me. And so if they tell me to do something, guess what? I'm going to do it. If they ask me to do something, say you should do something. Have you thought about doing something? Guess what submission means? It means that I am going to do it because I have placed myself under that person. So what Paul says here is pretty crazy, isn't it? I mean, we read past this verse because he's saying that we are submitting to one another. How in the world does that work? Like, I mean, what if I walk up to you guys? There's about 175 people in here. I walk up to you and say, I'm submitting to all of you. Some of you are going to say, wash my car. Some of you are going to say, vacuum my floors. And some of you are going to say, you should do this. And some are going to say that. And who do I listen to? And how does that work? And it almost doesn't even seem practical, does it? It almost seems like, Paul, this is just crazy talk that you're saying here when you're saying that we should submit or submitting to one another, until you look at the second half of this verse, which helps us understand what he's saying, because he doesn't say just submitting to one another. He uses that little phrase "out of" right here. It's one word in the Greek. We have to use two words in the English to translate it. And it's a word that means that what the source that it comes from. And so you might use it to describe a spring, the water that comes out of a spring. It's the same word that Paul uses later when he says, out of the heart. Like, out of the heart comes the words of the mouth. It's the idea that what we say isn't just really the point, but where it comes from, that it's what ultimately matters. And so he's saying you can tell what's in the heart by what comes out of the mouth. And that's not a sermon for today, but some of y'all need to take that home with you, okay? Because it's out of, and he's saying, listen, we are submitting to one another out of. This is coming from something, and what it's coming from is reverence for. And reverence is, again, it's sort of interesting because we're going to look at three words today in a couple of passages, submitting and reverence, and all three of them have the same root word, which means to put yourself under, to bow. And reverence is not just, though, a submission. Reverence is an awe, and that I respond to a person because of who they are and what they've done. You ever walked into a room and seen someone important? And you may not even know who they are, but you just know they're important. And at least they may think at least they're important because of just the way that they let off an aura about them. There's something important about who they are. And what Paul is saying is that the reason that we submit to one another is because out of us, inside of us, flowing from our very essence of our being, we have a reverence for, an awe for, an overwhelming sense of just falling on our knees before Christ because of who He is and what He's done. You see, what Christ did for us is what Paul is telling us to do for each other. Because Christ came and He gave up His life for us and lowered Himself so that we could have life. And so what that means is that submitting to one another is so much deeper than just, I have to do what you tell me to do, or you have to do what I tell you to do. No, submission is a life that's focused in the right direction, and that direction is Jesus. You know, when Paul was writing to the church in Philippi, a church not very far from the one in Ephesus, he says this, he says, doing nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interest of others. That Greek word here in this first verse, where it says do nothing from, right? That's the exact same word. The word in Greek is the exact same word that says that's out of in the book of Ephesians, where he's talking about do nothing out, submitting to one another out of reverence. And it's this idea that there's a reason. It's not just what we're doing, but why we're doing it. And he is telling us that we should do nothing from, nothing out of. He's getting to our very motives, to why we do what we do. And he's saying to you, he's saying to me, guys, we need to make sure that we do nothing, that nothing flows from us from a selfish ambition. He says, do nothing out of selfish ambition. Selfish ambition simply means that I'm going to do what I want, whatever it costs, and whoever it hurts. He's not saying, listen, this is so important because he's not saying that ambition in and of itself is wrong. In fact, I would say that if you look at the Bible, ambition, wanting more of something, the desire to do, to be, to accomplish more is a godly thing. So he's not saying ambition. He's not saying do nothing from ambition. He's saying do nothing from selfish ambition. Don't make life. Don't let your life be motivated by. Don't let your life be focused on, driven by what can I get for myself, and I need more for me. And if we're being honest with ourselves, much of our life, much of our world is selfish and all about me, and being selfish is easy for most of us, isn't it? And we see this everywhere. We see it everywhere we go. We see it. I mean, look, have you ever noticed how whenever someone is successful at something, the questions, the things that people say, well, why did they get that and not me? Or we look at someone who's successful and does something and we go, man, look at all that's wrong with them. And we begin to look at all of the problems and even try to tear them down. And we do that because, well, we think we need more. Selfish ambition is when we say that I'm going to have more of whatever it is to be happy or content. More money, more stuff, more likes on Instagram, more whatever it is. And if I can have just more, then I'm going to be happy, rather than saying I am happy and content with everything that God's given me, because He's a perfect God. And so we look around and we go, man, I just need more to be happy, and we never get there because we never have enough. Selfish ambition is when we value people for what they can do for us. And we look at the people in our lives, and we sometimes without even thinking it, don't we put people in categories? People I got to put up with because I have to work with them, or their family or whatever, so I guess I'll deal with them. People I don't want anything to do with because all they are is, and you can fill in the blank, whatever they are. And then, hey, this group of people, man, they make me feel good, or they help me, or they give me, or they whatever. And we begin to look at people based upon what they can do for us, because whether we realize it or not, we're being motivated, driven by selfish ambition, because we believe the lie of Satan that you need more. The second thing that he tells us not to do, he says, do nothing, not only from selfish ambition, but also from conceit. And conceit's a little bit different than selfish ambition, although they're definitely closely connected. Conceit says, I am the center of the universe. And not only do I want more, I want it all, or at least I want to do all that I want to do. It is ultimately the desire to be our own God. It's the lie that Satan told Adam and Eve back in the garden. You realize the very first lie that was ever spoken on the face of this earth was to Adam and Eve, where Satan comes to Adam and Satan comes to Eve and says, God doesn't want you to eat of this fruit, because if you do, you'll be your own God. You can do what you want to do. I know what God says. I know what God's told you. I know what God's directed. But hey, you get to do whatever you want to do. You can be in control. You can be your own God. And conceit is when I say, not just I want more, but I want to be my own God. And when Adam and Eve believed that lie and ate the fruit, the result of that was that their relationship with God was broken, their relationship with creation was broken, their relationship with each other was broken. What the result of that was that they ruined everything. In that same lie, when we believe that we can be our own God, it messes things up today, just like it did with Adam and Eve. You see, the lie looks like this, it sounds like this in our world. You can look at all of those images on television or on your computer late at night when no one's around, and no one's going to see and no one's going to know, and it's not going to hurt anyone. It's the same lie that we believe when we say that I can ignore my family and work really hard and I can be successful and forget about my family. Look, I'm at least providing for them, and we believe the lie that I can just take care of me. We believe the lie that says that I can consume as much as I want to consume, and you can fill in the blank of whatever it is that I can take in, whatever I want to take in, and it's not going to hurt anyone. It's the lie we believe that says I'll get around to my faith and to teaching my children faith and to the family of faith later. But right now we got other things to do in life. And we believe these lies because they don't seem that bad. No one knows. No one's going to be hurt. No one's going to see. No one's going to whatever. It's only me, and it's no big deal. And we believe it because we think that we can ignore God and be our own God. And then we wonder why our marriages are in so much trouble. And we wonder why our children walk away from the faith, and we wonder why our relationship with God is weak, and we wonder why we don't know or understand our purpose in life. And the reason is as simple as because we think we know better than God, and we're motivated by conceit. And when I'm motivated by conceit, then I look at everyone around me, and it's only about what they can do for me, and only about what I and my life and what affects me, and not even concerned for each other. And what Paul says, guys, is do nothing. Like the word nothing is pretty all-inclusive, isn't it? Doesn't leave any room for anything else or anything out. He says do nothing from. Don't let anything flow from your life. Don't let anything flow from you that is from selfish ambition or conceit. But he says, let me play with this for a minute. But he says, but in humility, count others as more significant than yourselves. I told you there's 3 words that we're going to look at that all have the same root word, and this is the third one. Because humility also has the same root word where we get the word bow from. And it's the idea that I submit, that I lower, hopefully that'll work, that I lower myself, not just because I'm not important, not just because I don't have value. You see, humility is not saying I'm nothing. Humility is not saying I don't have any value or significance. I don't have anything to offer this world or anything to offer people. That's not what humility is. Humility says I lower myself so I can lift you up. Humility says I choose to lower myself. My motivation isn't just to see what I can get out of this life. My motivation isn't it's all about me. My motivation is looking at what can I do to lift someone else up. And the reason we are humble, the reason that we do that is because we realize that every person that we come into contact with is created in the image of God, just like me. And I think most of us would believe that. But it means that people of other faiths are created in the image of God. It doesn't mean they're right. It just means they're created in the image of God and they have the same value before God that I do. It means that someone who looks different than me, who thinks different than I do, who votes different than me, that they are created in the image of God and they have infinite value before Him. So as a child of God, I don't look around and say, what can you do for me? Or what can I get from you? Or how are you treating me? I look at people and go, what can I do to humble myself so that I can lift you up, not just to a better life, but lift you up so that I can point you to Jesus. Because isn't that our ultimate goal? That I should humble myself so that I can lift someone else, point someone else to Jesus. And that's why I believe that submission is truly a life of strength. When we hear words like submit and humility and humble and all those kinds of words, isn't it our nature to think weak? Isn't it our nature to think, oh, someone who's humble, they're weak, they're not strong, they don't stand up for themselves, they don't defend themselves, they don't have any real strength or courage or whatever it is. And I'm here to tell you, if that's your picture of submission, if that's your picture of humility, then you do not understand who Jesus is. Because you see in Philippians chapter 2, Paul writes these words. They're some of my favorite words describing a passage describing Jesus. He says in verse 5, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus." Listen, talking about Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. You see what Paul is saying about Jesus? He's God. And like Jesus was there at creation. He's part of and I don't understand the Trinity. I can't grasp, I can't get my head around it, but he's God. He's been there from the beginning. He's all-knowing, all-powerful, all-present. He will be there after time ends. He is God. He doesn't need anything. He doesn't need anyone. There's nothing that's going to make him more God or less God. He is God. And you know what that God did? He emptied himself. The God who spoke, and out of nothing came everything, emptied himself and became someone that looked like you in one of your bodies, that gets hungry and tired and hurts and gets sunburned and has sore muscles and all the stuff that we have to put up with. He came and emptied himself and became like us for the whole purpose that one day he would die. And the most painful thing that Jesus did was not nailed to the cross. It's not the torture and suffering that led up to that. The most painful thing that Jesus did was allow God to place your sins and my sins upon him and to die, to pay the price for us. So if you think humility is weak, if you think submission is a sign of weakness, look at Jesus. Because he was strong enough to give up everything so that he could lift you up. And that's why submission is the strongest thing you can do. In fact, let's keep reading, because in verse 9 it says, "Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." What Paul is saying is, not only did Jesus humble himself, sacrifice himself for us, but after that was all done, God did the most amazing thing, because God took his Son who humbled himself and he lifted him up. And that includes the physical resurrection that happened 3 days later, but it was so much more than that, because it's his eternal position. You see, because Jesus humbled himself, he says now every knee will bow. And every tongue will confess, in heaven and on earth and below the earth. And everywhere there is a person, there will be a day when they will bow and say, "That is the King of Kings. That is the Lord of Lords. That is the most powerful being in all of creation. And he gave up everything for me." That is our hope as children of God. You see, what happens is that God took care of Jesus. Because in the end, submission is trusting God to take care of you. Isn't that what our concern is? I mean, isn't that what we worry about? That if I submit to one another, that if I humble myself, that if I say, you know what, I'm willing to sacrifice so that I can lift you up, isn't our fear that someone's going to take advantage of us? Someone's going to abuse us. Someone's going to run over us. Someone's going to do something that isn't right, and we're going to have to suffer the consequences. And you know what I say to that? Yes. Because that's what happened to Jesus. Jesus let you take advantage of him. Jesus let me take advantage of him. And he does every day when I ignore him, when I look past him, when I say, you know what, I don't care what you say, God, I'm going to do what I want to do. And Jesus goes, that's why I died. And so the issue is not, are people going to hurt us sometimes? Yes, people are going to hurt us. The issue is, do we trust God to take care of you? Do we trust God to lift you up? You know, when my kids were young, my son especially, he'd walk up to me and he goes, Dad, watch me jump. And I'd say, all right, son, go ahead and jump. And he'd get like, oh, he'd be all into it. And he would jump and he would get about that high off the ground. And I'd go, good job, son, you jumped high. He goes, yeah, Dad. And he was excited. And every now and then I'd say, son, jump. And I'd grab him by the back of the coat or something. It usually worked best when it was a coat. And he'd jump and I would throw him as high as I could in the air. Enough to make grandmas go, like that, right? You know what I'm talking about? And I'd throw that little boy as high as I could, and he would laugh and giggle, and I'd catch him, and we'd just play, and he had so much fun. I remember one time I did that. He jumped. I threw him up in the air, and I caught him. He goes, Dad, did you see how high I jumped? And I'm like, you loser. You couldn't even get 2 inches off the ground. I did all the work. I did all the work, right? And I'm the kind of dad I am. May not be good, but it's who I am. Sorry. And listen, I didn't call him a loser that day. He's 2. I promise I didn't. But isn't that what we do to God? Isn't that what we do to each other? Look at what I've done. Look at what I've accomplished. Look at what I've accumulated. Look at what I have gathered. Look at all the people who know my name and like me and think about me. And God goes, okay. Create something out of nothing and come talk to me. Go a day without sinning and come talk to me. I mean, like heal someone. Like really, just walk up and let them just touch your robe and let them be healed. Then come talk to me. God says, you know what? You can work hard and you can live a life that thinks you need to get gathers as much as you can because you need more. And you can live a life of conceit that thinks it all about you and you're going to get that high off the ground. But he promises that if we'll humble ourselves, lower ourselves and take the focus off ourselves, counting others as more significant than yourself, that if we will do that, he will pick us up. And I'm telling you, he'll throw you higher than you could ever imagine going on your own. And most of us waste our lives thinking it's all about me, rather than saying, how can I humble myself so that others can be lifted up? I received a letter not long ago, just a couple of months ago, from a pastor friend. In fact, early on in the 90s, I'd served as his youth pastor in a small church just south of Austin. And he wrote me this just beautiful letter. I mean, people actually still handwrite letters. I didn't know people did that, but they still do. And I got it and mailed it to the church here, and I was reading it in the office, and I'm trying not to cry because all the other guys are around. That's just embarrassing, right? Just sitting there reading the letter crying. But I'm reading it, and he's just like, really just saying, man, Stephen, I've been hearing about everything going on at Calvary, and I'm so excited. I'm praying for you, and I just want you to know, good job. And man, I'm just like I'm here for you if you ever need anything. And just I love you, brother. And that wasn't exactly the letter, but it was pretty close. And here's the thing about that man, that pastor friend of mine. The largest church he ever pastored had 120 people in it. I mean, Calvary's we got more in our first hour than he's ever had in a church that he's ever pastored. And he's never been the guy who's going to get on the speaking circuit and go around and talk about church and all that kind of stuff. He's never going to be asked to speak at a conference. He's never going to have his name known. He's never going to be famous. It's just not who he is, not in his personality. He doesn't even really want that. And yet, he's the guy Well, I can name a half a dozen men in ministry who were his youth pastor at some point, some part-time, barely paid kind of youth pastor at some point who he just loved and invested in and prayed for. And I'm telling you, if I ever have a day where I feel like, God, what am I even doing in ministry? I think I need to give this thing up. You know who I call? I call him. Because he's going to, every time I talk to him, he's going to lift me up. He's going to make me feel, he's going to change, he won't tell me a lie. He won't just say, oh, it's all good. No, he'll call me on my junk and tell me stuff. And he's harsh, and not harsh, but he's just truthful and honest and in just the most loving way possible. And I'm telling you, part of the reason I'm here today is because Mark, over those years, has just lifted me up. It doesn't matter if it's been a month or 6 months or a year or 5 years since I've talked to him, if I call him up, he'll drop everything and lift me. Now let me ask you, if one day when we're both in heaven and we're standing before God, do you think God's going to say, you know what, Stephen, you led a church of this size, and Mark, your church was way smaller. That's just one service at Stephen's church. Hey, Stephen's more important to me? I guarantee you God's going to go right past me and go to Mark. Because Mark for years has lifted people up. No one knows his name. No one knows his face. No one knows who he is. But he just lifts. And I want to challenge you. Regardless of if anyone knows your name. Regardless of how much you accumulate in this life and in this world. Will you trust that if you lift God, if you lift people, if you encourage people, if you humble yourselves, that God's going to lift you up and take care of you? I want to read this verse one more time for us, because he says this: do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Today, will you be honest with yourself about what you're living for? About what motivates you, about what drives you and your decisions and the way you treat people? Is it selfish ambition, I need more? Is it conceit, it's all about me? Or is it humility, that I lower myself to lift people up? And some of us, we disguise these first two really well, and we pretend like we're more than we are, but maybe we just need to be honest that we are living for selfish ambition or conceit, and we need to pray, God, forgive me, because I want to live to lift people up. And if you do, if you can sit here today and say that I want to live for humility, then here's the prayer I want you to pray for the next couple of weeks. It is a simple prayer, and if you pray it, it'll change your life. But the prayer is this: God, will you give me one person today that I can lift up? Maybe it's praying for them. Maybe it's an encouraging word. Maybe it's giving them something. Maybe it's forgiving them. I don't know what it's going to be. But maybe you just pray every day this week, next week, for the next few weeks. God, give me one person today that I can lift up. You don't have to tell them. You don't have to tell anyone else. No one has to know but you and God. But will you? God, give me one person today that I can lift up. If I had to say the bottom line today is that lift others and trust God to lift you. Amen. He will take care of you if you will humble yourself and lift others up.